All right, so for the next video lecture here, we're going to take a look at the spinal nerves. Now, your peripheral nervous system is pretty complex. If you're looking at a diagram of the peripheral nervous system, which consists of all these nerves that extend outward to all different parts of the body, you have a whole bunch of different peripheral nerves, and they have lots of different names. We don't require that you learn to identify all of those different peripheral nerves. We only, as far as the spinal nerves, we only ask that you learn how to identify the main branches off of the spinal cord, and they're very easy to learn how to identify because they're numbered according to their locations, and it uses the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal terminology that you learned when you studied the skeletal system. So we're going to be zooming in around the vertebrae, and for example right there and right over there, that is a pair of spinal nerves that are connecting into the spinal cord in between two of the cervical vertebrae. So those are the ones that we're going to be focusing in on. Before we do that, I am going to go back to PowerPoint diagram here because there are some generic features I want to take a look at with your spinal nerves. So I'm bringing this diagram back up for you. And so your spinal nerves exist in pairs, and they connect to the spinal cord. So they're cut off here. Here's a spinal nerve on this side. Here's a spinal nerve over here on this particular side. And as that spinal nerve approaches the spinal cord, notice that it branches into two roots. So this root is actually, this is the anterior side of the spinal cord here. This is called the anterior or the ventral root that I'm tracing there with the cursor. And then this root here on the back side is called the dorsal root. And then notice as it gets really close to the spinal cord, it actually splits up into lots of little rootlets that extend to, you know, the various gray matter areas within this portion of the spinal cord at multiple levels. That way you're making use of every level within the spinal cord. Notice the dorsal root has this swollen area on each side. Okay, and so that's called the dorsal root ganglion on each side. So a ganglion is an area outside of the central nervous system where you have clusters of neuron cell bodies. All right, so in your dorsal root ganglia, that's where you have the cell bodies of your sensory neurons. And those are, if you've been watching the physiology lectures, those are unipolar in terms of their structure and appearance. And a unipolar neuron has a cell body that then has a little stalk that connects to the one long appendage that it has. And that's what your sensory neurons look like. So all the neurons whose axons are transmitting impulses about touch and pressure and pain and temperature, things like that, those action potentials are traveling inward. Those are afferent impulses incoming. And the cell bodies of those neurons are located there in that swollen area, the dorsal root ganglion. And then they wind up passing through these rootlets and connecting here where they interface with interneurons that are sitting there in the dorsal horn in that gray matter area of the spinal cord on that side. Your ventral root over here has outgoing axons of the motor neurons whose cell bodies are sitting there in the ventral or the anterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. So outgoing impulses and axons this way, incoming or afferent impulses this way. Afferent in, efferent with an E, exiting, going out. And then they wind up being combined together in the spinal nerves. Now those spinal nerves don't stay in those big thick bundles for very long. They're going to start splitting up, and branches will extend to various parts of the body. But that's the basic structure of what these major spinal nerve pairs look like, where they connect into the spinal cord. All right, so let me go back over here to visible body. And let me zoom out a little bit here. Okay, so how do we name our spinal nerve pairs? Okay, first of all, I am going to strip off some ligaments here so we can see the deeper structures. And then kind of in brown right there, that's representing the dura mater. So I'm actually going to hide that so we can see the spinal cord underneath. And if we kind of zoom in here. All right, this is your C1 vertebra, the atlas. This is C2, C3. Oops, I didn't mean to zoom in there though. C4, etc. And you have the first 8 pair of spinal nerves extending off of the spinal cord are numbered C1 through C8. So your C1 pair right there and right over there, and we're looking over on the dorsal side. That's your C1 pair. Your C1 pair are sitting above the C1 vertebra. Okay, so we'll deselect those. And then down in here, this is your C2. Oops, didn't mean to connect that one. That's your C2 spinal nerves. The C2 sits between the C1 and the C2 vertebra. Okay. All right, then you got C3. We can kind of, let's see, right there and right over there. We're getting a little bigger now. C3 sits between the C2 vertebra and the C3 vertebra. And there's your C4 on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. C4 sits between the C3 and the C4. And then you just keep doing that up and down. And finally, your C8 pair of spinal nerves sits underneath. Now, if you guys remember from your anatomy of the vertebral column, you only have 7 cervical vertebrae, but your C8 pair of spinal nerves will sit between the C7 vertebra and your T1 vertebra. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. All right, so there's our C7 vertebra. I'm going to kind of rotate this around and look in here. And so right there, that's C7. All right, so right there, there's your C8 spinal nerve on the left. So that is extending outward from the spinal cord, and it's underneath the C7 vertebra, and it's on top of the T1 vertebra. Okay, so there's the C8 spinal nerve over on the right hand side. And don't panic on a test. When I highlight these for you, you'll be able to clearly see which vertebrae they're extending out from under, but you do need to review if you don't remember the numbering of your vertebrae. And you got to know the C, it's the C1 sit on top, your C1 spinal nerve sit on top of the C1 vertebrae, and then C2 is between 1 and 2, and you go on down to C8, and those C8 spinal nerves are between your C7 vertebra on top and your T1 vertebra underneath. Now actually after that it actually gets easier, because the next one is going to be your T1 pair of spinal nerves, and they sit right under. There's your T1 vertebra. Deselect everything. T1 vertebra, and let me kind of rotate in. Then you've got spinal nerve over there, spinal nerve over here. Your T1 spinal nerves sit underneath the T1 vertebra. Let's deselect those, and then here's T2. Your T2 spinal nerves sit underneath the T2 vertebra. And then here's T3 right in there. There's T4 underneath the T4 vertebra. T5 right there, and oops, highlighting stuff I don't want to highlight there. T5, underneath the T5 vertebra, and so forth and so on. If we keep going down, I get a little easier to see as we go farther down the spinal cord. There's your T9 vertebra. So underneath the T9 vertebra, you're going to have your T9 spinal nerve on each side. And if you guys remember, you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. So let's deselect all of those. There's 10, there's 11, and there's 12. So underneath your T12 vertebra, what do you have? You've got the T12 spinal nerve on each side. So that's pretty straightforward. All right, then you guys remember you've got your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and you have L1, L2, L3, L4, and L5 spinal nerves that are underneath each of those vertebrae. Okay, so deselect all of those. There's your L1 vertebra, and right there, and right there. Those are your L1 spinal nerves. There's your L2 vertebra, and right underneath it, right there, and right there, those are your L2 spinal nerves. So those are pretty straightforward. And if we continue on down, now when you get down to the sacrum level, I'll highlight some structures there and hide them. When you get down to the sacrum level, you have 5 pair of sacral spinal nerves. So for example, highlighting in blue there, it's pretty short. That's S1 on each side, and then down in there, there's S2, and then you've got S3, not right there, but right in there on that side, and on that side as well. Those are your S3 spinal nerve, and kind of rotate around so you can see those. And then you have an S4 and an S5 pair of spinal nerves. Let me hide those ligaments. And then finally, when you get down to the coccyx, let me hide that ligament and hide that ligament as well. All right, I stripped off some additional tissues down here lower around the sacrum. There's your S4, spinal nerve on each side. If we rotate it around, you can see better the S4 spinal nerves, and then your S5s are kind of wimpy right there and right there. Those are your S5 spinal nerves, so they're pretty small. And the invisible body's not showing it, but you also have small, what are called coccygeal nerves. You just have 1 pair of those. Those are designated as CO1, and you have 1 over on the left and 1 over on the right as well. All right, so I just wanted to show you those on visible body so you can kind of see some of the complexity that's there. As far as on a test, I'm probably on a test question, I'm just going to use like a diagram where you'll have to count the vertebrae from top to bottom and know your vertebral numbering. And so if you see a pair of spinal nerves extending underneath lumbar vertebra number 3, those are your L3 spinal nerves. If they are, you just have to keep track of your numbering up in the cervical region because it's different up in there. C1 is actually on top of the C1 vertebra. C2 is between 1 and 2. C3 is between your C2 and your C3 vertebrae on down through C8. And then once you start in with your T1, T2, T3, etc., pair of spinal nerves, they're named for the vertebra that they're under. So it's easier once you get past those cervical vertebrae. Also, I wanted to point out to you that the spinal cord, let's see, does not really exist below the L1 level or so, L1 to L2 in most people. you notice like there's the L1 vertebra here on visible body. And do you notice how, if we kind of zoom in, do you see how you don't really have a solid spinal cord in there anymore? You've just got a bunch of rootlets of your, yeah, there we go. We strip off the dura mater and we can take a closer look in there. See how the spinal cord is no longer a solid structure. You have a bunch of rootlets of these lumbar and sacral and eventually the coccygeal spinal nerves down in that area. So instead of having the spinal cord below L1, you've got all these nerve roots that kind of flare together, and that structure is sometimes called the cauda equina, which literally means horsetail because it kind of looked like a horse's tail to the early anatomists. All right, so that's all you need to know for your spinal nerves. The last little clip will be on the cranial nerves, which are the peripheral nerves that connect directly to the brain and the brainstem, and you have 12 pair of those. So we'll take a look at those on the last video clip for your Unit 5 anatomy.